This is what I've been waiting for. I made a long play in December, and it had benefits at the time, but this is what it was really for. Switch to Resolve in December, given that video editing is pretty much everything that was keeping me on Windows. Get used to it, and then, now, get that moved over to Linux too. I can never do that with Premiere, but now I can. I don't have a Windows VM or a Windows partition at all on any of my devices. I'm on the other side, but it was not easy. There are chapters in the playback bar if you're uninterested in an explanation of what Resolve is and why I switched to it, but that's what I'll be going over first. I used to edit my videos in Adobe Premiere without even having to pirate it thanks to my school's license, and I got fairly good at it, I'd say. Maybe not at editing techniques, but I was fairly familiar with the software, at least as much as I needed to be. It was fast, it was popular, so there were lots of guides, and even though I'd heard of Resolve before, especially at the start of my editing journey, the UI seemed even more foreign, and I just I couldn't figure out where to begin with it, so I stuck with Premiere. Oh, well, a more accurate way of phrasing that is that I put up with Premiere. What is there to put up with? Well, I found it to be more stable on a dual-core 4th gen Mac Mini with 8 gigs of RAM and no GPU, so little RAM that was probably actually going to swap, it was running out of RAM and writing files to disk instead. It was more stable on that than a computer with a Ryzen 6 core and a 6600 XT for GPU acceleration and 32 gigs of RAM. And that's not just a my PC thing. From looking online, other people's words, anecdotes, seems to corroborate the fact that Premiere is just better on Mac. But it's not like I can switch to Mac, so... I mean, obviously it ran better on my computer, but... just seriously, Premiere had so many issues. So often would it just decide that the spacebar just shouldn't play the video anymore. And by the spacebar, I mean anything. I would just realize it because I'd press the spacebar, but then actually I'd go and press play and it also wouldn't, and I'd just have to restart Premiere. Or the playback head would just no longer scrub through the video and I'd have to restart Premiere, or it would just straight up close. And you might say that, well, your computer's overclocked, the CPU and the GPU, so maybe that's why. And yes, that's true. I can't expect perfect stability from anything, but I had no stability issues with anything else. So regardless, I can single out Premiere as weirdly unstable. Beyond that, the way they handle installations and licensing is very frustrating. Thank you, Adobe, for making me install your Creative Cloud launcher when I only care about 2 of your apps, and thanks for adding a bunch of startup apps and background processes, and thanks for making me deal with that when I have a real license, but then the people who pirate your software get a better experience. It's ridiculous. So I guess you could generously say that I was getting tired of Adobe, and so I actually made a video about that explaining why it was Resolve that I switched to, but basically I have switched to Resolve. What does that have to do with Linux? Adobe doesn't care about Linux, and Resolve, or at least the software that became Resolve in version 7, I think, was Linux exclusive at one point. I think part of that was officially you had to use some Davinci distribution of Linux, then that expanded to Red Hat and CentOS, and given that was the case, and there's a free version and stuff, people have figured it out on other distros. And obviously now it's available on Mac and Windows too. Mac coming before Windows, which is just, this is so backwards. Like, when I think of software distribution, I think Windows, Mac, Linux is kind of how the availability should go, but Davinci went backwards. Anyway, yes, you can get it working on whatever Linux distro you want, but if you want it to be an easy time, it's going to be CentOS or Red Hat. So, given I'm not going to switch to those, I guess I may as well chronicle my adventures in getting Linux video editing to work for me. And as you can tell by the runtime of the video, I'm trying to figure out which direction I'd have to look at the end of the playback bar. This is not going to be fast, so there are chapters in the playback bar if you want to skip to interesting sections. The 2 machines I'll be looking at are my desktop, which is all-AMD, woohoo Linux, and my laptop, which is NVIDIA. 2 very different experiences. Both complicated, one definitely more so. Welcome to the desktop section. If you want to see the laptop bit, there are chapters in the playback bar below, so you always know where you are. Anyway, at the time I was running Fedora 37, currently I'm running Fedora 38. And so it stood to reason to me that my first course of action should just be try to run the default official Resolve installer for Linux, since although it's only officially supported by CentOS and Red Hat, how different really is Red Hat from Fedora? quite a bit, as it turns out. The installer opened, and it installed, and Resolve actually opened. But it just said that my GPU configuration was unsupported, and I went to change it, it just saw no GPUs. No trouble, I thought, naively. This is just some OpenCL thing, so I'll just, install the proprietary drivers. No. Not out of some ideological offense to the concept of proprietary drivers. That is something that I feel, but I would also rather have working proprietary than not working open source. That's part of why I picked Resolve as my video editor rather than something like Kdenlive. But because I actually had issues. Firstly, I just couldn't get them to install on Fedora 37, so... But also, secondly, if I did manage to get them installed, I would still need the open source ones for SteamVR, because otherwise, that and ALVR breaks with the proprietary ones, but it works fine with the open source ones, whereas Resolve really needs the open source ones, really needs the closed source ones to actually work properly. And in this case, the open source ones I had installed on Fedora weren't getting detected at all. I think that balancing the proprietary and the open source ones on the same system is possible, but that is just a lot of hacking, and at that point I don't know if it's even worth it, and I just want Resolve to work, so I don't see why it has to be such a hassle, and that just seems really yeah, stock Fedora's out. Yes, Nobara exists, but for a few reasons, mainly me not liking the stock tweaks they actually makes, I'm not going to switch to that. Arch has an AUR package, but there's a reason I used to be on Arch and now I'm not. I value stability more than I once did. And a virtual machine is what I already use for Windows with Resolve. But, I don't know, having two Linux distros, potentially even running the same kernel but virtualized, just seems silly. That same kernel thing, though, is an important thing to remember, since it's important. What if we had two distros share the kernel, so there's no virtualization? Containers. Delightfully devilish, Seymour. Sudo DNF install distrobux create editing arch, -s Davinci Resolve, and success? Yes, actually, with a few solvable issues. Resolve isn't in my app menu, distrobux export. Audio isn't working? I forgot where I found the solution to this, but you do -s ALSA plugins, and then edit asound.conf as follows. But then there was a much bigger one. Color grading would cause it to crash, and text plus would cause it to crash, and lots of things would cause it to crash. Using Fusion would cause it to crash. And then I looked on GitHub and I found a thing saying a new version of Rockham broke Resolve, and it was very, very worrying that new version of Rockham was very old, and you can only downgrade so far. Well, at least without it being a huge pain. And I saw a more recent comment on that issue talking about the recent version of Resolve, and I don't think they ended up mentioning a solution. So maybe I'm stuck not being able to color grade. That would be really awkward, and also using the old text effect. But no. Actually, the solution is very easy, -s OpenCL AMD. That does mean that my OpenCL drivers are no longer open source, but they work. Desktop editing gets a thumbs up. And there's still a laptop. Oh god. Yep, laptops are notorious for having no weird power management issues, no weird drivers, and they famously have much simpler software configs than desktops. Or is it the other way around? Yeah, I'm being bitten from all sides here. But before we get to that, what specs are we dealing with? I've got a quad-core 8th gen Core i7, a GTX 1060, and 16 gigs of RAM running on Fedora 38. And there were a few issues that I was expecting to deal with. I looked online and found that people on Fedora 38 were having an issue with libpango, which I'd never heard before, but it was causing issues. And I've heard from the Linux experiment that Resolve on NVIDIA is actually meant to be a better experience than on AMD. But, not for me. Besides from Resolve things themselves, I have two issues with the NVIDIA drivers. The first is that it makes it awkward to update, because with AKMods, which is what Fedora uses, whereas everyone else uses DKMS, with AKMods, I can't update my laptop normally, because when it builds the kernel modules for the NVIDIA drivers, then it sets the current kernel as a dependency. So when I go to update and replace that kernel, then it won't let me remove it because it's a dependency, so I have to manually go in and allow that to happen. Awkward, but not a deal breaker. But then there's a second issue specific to this one laptop. let me show you in Resolve. So when the laptop is plugged in, and yes, I guess that does spoil that eventually I get Resolve working. The laptop is plugged in and I press play, and that's either me or a pencil on the screen, depending on which I decide to show, and you can see it's working fine. And then when I unplug it, for a few seconds everything's fine, and then everything breaks down. You can't use the NVIDIA GPU properly when you're on Linux when the laptop is on battery. We're going to address that later though, because let's get to Resolve. At first, I tried the proper Resolve installer, like I first tried on the desktop, thinking that maybe NVIDIA would help me, and I got that libpango issue, so I looked on Reddit and I found out that you can just move some files in the Resolve directory and it'll fix that, so I did that, but then it just gave me nothing. No UI, not even an error in the terminal, and I didn't even bother to capture the output of this, so I guess we can just move on, which is a shame, but yeah, stock Fedora also was not going to work. But, you know what? I hear that Pop! OS is great on laptops, and if you've watched my first Surface Book 2 videos, then you know that no, I don't actually think it has a very good... It doesn't mix well with my workflow on a laptop, especially since this is a touchscreen laptop, and it doesn't like... Pop! OS isn't a fan of touchscreens. But we're going to try that because I think if there's any hope of me getting this to work, it will be on Pop! OS, and then I can base my Fedora making it work on what I've had to do to Pop! OS. On there, I follow the Pop! OS Resolve installer guide, and it doesn't work. But it works way better than before it launches, but shows GPU processing error when I put in a clip that Linux Resolve definitely should be able to process. Is this a deal breaker? Is there just something wrong with the GPU or the drivers on Linux? No. As it turns out, all I need to do is make Resolve use my dedicated GPU. And you might think, it is. But I would answer, I just have to make it use the GPU harder? I honestly don't quite understand the logic behind this. You can see in the menu that it says it's using a GTX 1060, but I actually have to right-click Resolve before I launch it and press Launch with Dedicated GPU, and when that works, it works. Sadly though, we're not nearly done, and it's time to get to the NVIDIA power management issue. But if you don't want to see me go on an NVIDIA thing, then use the chapters and skip past that. Right, well, what exactly is this issue? Well, if I install the official NVIDIA drivers on the distros I've tried, Pop, Ubuntu, Arch, and Fedora, which turned into 5 somehow, and then I run an app that uses the dedicated GPU while the laptop's plugged in, it'll run fine. But then if I unplug it, the GPU gets limited to 7 watts of power consumption, which is not reasonable. It actually tends to perform worse than the integrated GPU, so there's no point in using the 1060 then. Obviously, mobile video editing, especially on a laptop like this, as opposed to something like Apple Silicon, is a power-hungry endeavor. So it's not like I'd be doing it often, especially since I've got a desktop that will handle it much better, but I do want the freedom to be able to do it. So if you're willing to go on this probably 6 or 7 minute tangent away from the stuff more directly related to Resolve, then... here we go. If not, remember the chapters in the playback bar. So I search up this issue, and it turns out that, yeah, it's a known issue, but a known issue where every thread I find ends in, this hasn't been solved yet, which is very worrying to me, because that makes it sound like it's not an NVIDIA driver or Linux thing, it's a firmware thing. And my reasoning for that is as follows. Why would something on Linux be causing this? Why would NVIDIA want this? Why would something on Linux want this? In any power profile I set, it just happens between all of these distros. Why would it want that? Why would this be desired behavior? And if it's just a bug, why just this laptop? That doesn't make sense to me. So, especially on a laptop like this one, where the user might reasonably expect to disconnect the GPU in use, it might make sense that there's some weird firmware level trickery going on with the GPU to handle, like, the safety of the disconnecting or something, is just what was going through my head. And so, oh no, there might be a firmware switch that Windows is toggling and that Linux just can't do. And if so, I just can't do anything about this, which is why I haven't for the past nearly 7 months. But one day, a few days ago actually, I just had the thought that surely this is solvable. Because despite all the logic I just ran you through about why would Linux cause this, surely it's something that Linux isn't doing that is causing this, I also thought, yes, logically that's true, but behaviorally it would be weird if this was a firmware thing, because as I showed you before, when you unplug the laptop, it takes a few seconds for the performance to break down, and that makes it seem like it's an operating system thing. It happens precisely when Linux realizes, like the battery indicator shows me that the laptop has been unplugged. There's a few second delay. And if this was a firmware thing, I wouldn't expect that to be the case. So despite these two conflicting theories of mine, I thought, okay, it could be this one, so I'm going to give it a go. And after doing lots of searching, and I mean lots, including repeatedly going over the same threads again to make sure there was nothing missed, I found a single thread to pull from Justin Thomas? Justin Thomas? I didn't write down his last name. And I think he is going to be what saves me. Disable the ACPI AC module? Don't mind if I... How? I found the Surface Linux build guide and followed it, but I just kept getting this same error, and it wasn't actually telling me what the error was, and when I searched it, it seemed like it could relate to a bunch of different things, and so after well over an hour of trying to fix that, I realized true strength is knowing when to ask for help. So I asked the Matrix server, and not only was I given a helpful guide on what that error might be and kind of the fact that I was showing an incomplete error, but I was also given a better guide on how to recompile the kernel and the proper way of disabling the ACPI AC module. You might have noticed that I didn't mention that before when I was saying that I rebuilt the kernel, and that's because all I did was delete ACPI AC.c from the Linux kernel files. That wasn't what was causing the error though, because I tried re-adding it and it was still happening. It turned out all that was going wrong was that I was missing a single package. So I built the kernel with the option set in configs. I put it onto my laptop because obviously I was using my desktop's power to recompile the Linux kernel, and then I just copied over to the laptop and I installed it and it didn't work. Oh, I was so disheartened. I was in denial, and just as I thought that Justin might not be the hero I'd hoped for, I realized. I went back and looked at how I built the kernel, and I looked at the configs that I set, and I realized that the ACPI AC being off setting didn't actually apply, even though I saved the file. And that's because I saved it to the top of the file. But it actually already existed, saying yes rather than no, lower down in the file. So that took priority. So I changed that setting, and I saved it, and I rebuilt it, and yes. Yes, I know that I'm dramatizing it a bit here, but this issue has been going on for so long, and there was one person who'd mentioned it, and the people in the GitHub issue just ignored him. I don't know how that happened. But it turns out he was right, and so I was very excited. There was a slight issue in that it only worked from a cold boot. So the driver was tricked when you first turned the laptop on, but then when you plugged it in and then unplugged it, it would realize it was on battery, which is interesting, but it was usable. I posted my findings back onto the Matrix server, and one Dorian Stoll had a great idea. Right, so we know this ACPI AC thing works, which means it mustn't be a firmware thing, which means it must be an NVIDIA driver thing. So why are we messing with the whole kernel when we could just mess with the NVIDIA driver? And the NVIDIA driver isn't open source, but some of it is. And by changing one variable to always be true, we can make the NVIDIA driver have no clue when the laptop's on battery and have it always think it's plugged in. And it works. It actually even fixes the only on a cold boot issue too, and it means I can keep a vanilla kernel. Honestly, this is awesome. Thanks, Justin Thomas on GitHub, for the initial thread that let me make this idea happen. And actually, you deserve more credit. Thanks for the initial solution that wasn't perfect, but it did actually work, and seemingly no one else paid attention to his working fix. Thanks to Dorian Stoll for being smarter than me and taking that, this works, how can we improve on it, and making the actual final fix that I ended up using. And thanks to QZ for not only helping me with actually managing to compile the kernel better, but also just look at how active he is on that Matrix server. Like, it's really cool to see someone who cares so much about an open source project. It's really cool. But this video was meant to be about me getting Resolve to work, and now it works on battery. So let's get back to that. Alright, so now in Pop! OS, my Resolve editing experience is practically perfect. Scaling is a bit weird in the sense that everything is small, and if I want everything to be big, then I have to enable fractional scaling, but leave it on 200% still. Then everything goes big but blurry, and honestly, I prefer this much smaller view because it gives me a lot more room to work with on the same size screen. I'm going to take advantage of having a high-resolution laptop. I'm going to keep it that way. I'm a big fan. And then I had to go and ruin it by switching back to Fedora. I could pretend that actually everything just is ruined, and I was just like, no, Pop! OS isn't worth it, I'll just have Fedora and no Resolve, but no. If I go to Fedora and install the DKMS NVIDIA drivers rather than the default AKMods ones so that I can rebuild them with the change suggested, and I copy over the distro box from my computer to the laptop, then I install the NVIDIA drivers into the distro box from this DistroBox NVIDIA GitHub repo, it works. And to make it even easier, I can add the equivalent of right-clicking it and pressing launch using dedicated GPU into the .desktop file, the thing that shows up in the app menu. I can add it to that so that it automatically does that. It works. We're done. I really mean it. This is the last paragraph of the 3,000-word video script I wrote. I do write scripts, by the way. I just don't actually read them verbatim. Like, I write them word for word, but then I just use them as really detailed notes because that's what works best for me, even if it's probably really inefficient and I could probably do with a prompter, but I don't use one. Anyway, given VR was figured out recently too, this is it for Windows. The only other things I could possibly care about are some Windows-only games, and I honestly do not care about them enough to have Windows still involved with me. So this is it. No more virtual machine on my computer and no more dual boot partition on my laptop. It's done. Hopefully, if you've enjoyed this video, you've got something to say about it in either the comments or the Discord server or the Matrix server, which are both in the description, because, I don't know, hopefully someone found this far too complicated video helpful. Subscribe if you'd like to, and bye.